In the early 20th century, mental illness was discussed behind closed doors. Locked away like criminals, those suffering from it endured barbaric conditions. But a young nurse, Agnes Mary Richards, chose to make a difference in the lives of women diagnosed with mental afflictions. Her vision not only opened up new horizons for her patients, it was a forerunner of change in the mental health care industry. She created a different kind of sanctuary with a home-like environment, decorated cottages, and beautiful gardens, providing rest, relaxation, and mental stimulation. Nestled in the secluded Crescenta Valley of North Glendale. It was called Rockhaven.
There's a somebody I'm longing to see. I hope that he turns out to be someone who watch over me.
Agnes Richards was employed at Cook County Hospital in Chicago when World War I broke out. And like many brave young nurses of her generation, volunteered to serve.
My grandmother told me that she worked for the American Red Cross in World War I and was in France. And the doctor from under whom she served sent all the nurses a telegram to come to California, I have a job for you. And she came and she worked at Patton State Hospital in Los Angeles County, and I think they called it the psychopathic unit. Because terminology was so bare in those days, you know, it was really appalling.
At Patton and other area hospitals, including what is now County USC, she observed firsthand the type of treatment that patients with mental illness received. She became anxious to establish her own facility and staff it with a medical team that would practice the type of treatment and care she felt was more compassionate and humane.
My grandmother, as a young nurse, worked at some of the state institutions in California and was very depressed by the care that the patients got. And my grandmother felt that the patients there had no dignity. If you were committed as a mentally ill person in the state of California in those days, it was really very, very hard for people. And she thought that she could do a better job. And so she opened Rockhaven in January 1923 for 6 ladies.
Ivan Cole, longtime groundskeeper, recognized that Agnes had found the perfect site for her facility.
There was moments when she had the yearn to have a place of her own. And that spark triggered a lot of things in her head. Where could she find that place? Well, where better a place could she find?
In the late 1800s, the Crescenta Valley enjoyed an enviable reputation for its fresh, dry air and mountain views. Dr. Benjamin Briggs had already established what would become one of several sanitariums that treated lung diseases and other illnesses.
Its founding father, Benjamin Briggs, based this valley's industry on sanitariums like this one. And you know, in the 10s and 20s, there were 20-some of these sanitariums scattered around the valley. This was the place for sanitariums, and this is the last surviving one.
In the search for a location to start her own facility, Agnes found a house with a rock facade in this valley. In 1923, she rented the Rock House on Honolulu Boulevard in Montrose, California. It was the inspiration for the name of her facility.
The first building that she rented to start her business was the Rock House. And I think the Haven is sort of obvious. It's a refuge for people that need rest and care. The Rock House was there when she rented it in 1923. And she told me that she rented that house for $125 a month. She never did buy it until she was in business for a while and would save her money. I think it was difficult for her to establish that kind of a business because I don't think the neighbors were ready for mental health issues. The public at large, I think, was totally unfamiliar with mentally ill people. And when my grandmother started out, she had to look to county patients to fill her establishment.
Rockhaven's reputation for being a quality women's hospital attracted many new patients. And with these new patients, Agnes needed to expand her facility. The Rock House was not adequate to meet the demand.
Over the years, she bought other properties adjacent to where she rented the house and built other buildings. And the Rockhaven as it is today was completed in 1940. Rockhaven actually, as it was 12 lots.
The Rockhaven grounds eventually encompassed almost 3.5 acres. Most of the buildings still exist today, including the Rose and Coulter cottages.
The Rose Cottage was a neighbor house that she bought and turned around, and the Coulter Cottage, those were not buildings that she built. The newest building is the Oaks, and that was completed in 1940. My grandmother named the buildings with trees and plants because that was her love. She loved gardening, and she was very partial to these names.
Each building has its names. The names tend to be horticulturally oriented, so the residents were just in building A, they lived in the Pines, or they lived in the Coulter, or they lived in the Rose Cottage. Each building has its own unique identity and its own character that was by name and also by design, clearly from Agnes.
She said that when she'd get a new patient, she'd just run out and get a bed. Her business really grew because looking at the old licenses, she told me she started out with 6 patients, and in 1924, I think she was licensed for 25. So it really grew fast, and the most patients we ever had was 104. We were licensed by the Department of Mental Hygiene, and we definitely took people with mental diagnosis. And then as the years went on, the regulations were more stringent on care for mental patients. We were at the right place at the right time, and we just naturally emerged into taking care of dementia. And then we referred to them as residents because they were residents. They weren't patients. They weren't sick. They were just not able to function in a normal environment, and they could have a very normal life within the concepts of their illness.
Today, Rockhaven is the last remnant of what was once a large, thriving medical community. It is essential in the telling of the history of the Crescenta Valley. Rockhaven had the unique distinction of being a facility run by women, including Agnes Richards, and serving women patients in a time of history when women were marginalized.
Rockhaven is significant. In fact, this is probably one of the top half-dozen most significant sites in the city of Glendale from the standpoint of history. And what is remarkable is that it's all still here. When I first walked on to the site, I have to say honestly, it was a little bit more than just a project, just because my own personal interest in local history in Glendale. And obviously the landscaping, with my landscape background, how could you not be really taken by a beautiful site like this?
In the teens and 20s, this valley was originally populated by people in search of the freshest air they could find in the country. At that time, nearly 24 sanitariums were in the foothills, and Rockhaven is the last remaining link to this valley's past. Rockhaven survived the 1934 flood, which devastated the valley, and the changes to the valley in the 1940s, which transformed into suburbia instead of resort homes, orchards, and health sanitariums, a trend that continued into the 1970s with the building of the 210 freeway. Throughout the 78 years that Rockhaven was owned and operated by Agnes Richards and her granddaughter, Pat Travis, the main priority never changed: providing a caring and compassionate home for the residents.
The philosophy behind Rockhaven was to make this feel like home. That's why there's so many gardens, that's why there's so many flowers, that's why there's little areas to sit. And that's why the rooms themselves were very cheery. They had wallpaper, they had curtains, they had television sets in them, they had sitting areas, visiting rooms for the family to come in.
The Rose Cottage was completely done by an interior decorator. It was all done at one time. It was beautiful because everything was coordinated and it was very eye-appealing. And it was amazing to me how people would go into that cottage and have so much self-esteem because they thought that people thought well enough of them for them to be in such a beautiful environment. And they felt really so good about themselves. I saw an improvement in the patients just for having a nicer environment. It was very home-like.
There weren't any other facilities that I was ever at or visited that gave as many personal needs and care that were given at Rockhaven to the patients, the people. It was like a home, better than if they were at home. Pat and her grandmother were always helping people. No matter what it was they needed, they were always there for them and supplied people with everything they ever needed.
We didn't want to be a nursing home because all the other nursing homes could take care of people that were confined to bed and wheelchairs. We wanted to be for ambulatory patients only that needed to have more activities and to keep their mental condition so that they could function in such a setting, a home-like environment with mental stimulation.
Residents decorated their own rooms with family photos and personal belongings. A bright dining room with colorful wallpaper not only reflected a family atmosphere at mealtimes, it served as a community room for entertainment. In keeping with the philosophy that residents were happiest when occupied, a separate activity room provided a place for arts and crafts.
Pat provided all sorts of craft work for the patients, and they worked on all the different things like painting and embroidery and knitting, crocheting, everything in the way of crafts.
When Lois Demos, she was a registered occupational therapist, had enough residents that were able to do quality work, and we didn't know what to do with everything they made. So we decided that we were going to have a bazaar and make money and then put the money back in the activity room.
A lot of them were allowed to go out on different things, so I take them out to eat or to shop.
In order to make the residents' lives as normal and happy as possible, Agnes Richards and her granddaughter, Pat Travis, celebrated all major holidays and hosted a number of other special events for the residents.
The special events were always planned around our current population. So if we had a lot of patients that were able to do things, then we would be able to have activities where they would be more independent. And if they weren't able to do them, then we could rely upon wonderful volunteers.
We had entertainment people come in, or people would play instruments. There were many occasions which would be quite nice for the staff and, of course, the resident.
La Crescenta Presbyterian Church Clipper Club came for years and would play table games with the residents at night. And we always had a table of bridge, and it was wonderful for them.
They had special occasions, parties all the time, and they were really beautiful. And all the affairs there were really, really outstanding.
Other activities that were almost yearly was Halloween. We would invite school children to come in their costumes and we would enjoy them. And we always enjoyed Hawaii Admission Day by having a luau. And the ladies would all wear muumuus, and we would have paper leis that they all wore, and we had professional dancers come in, and they were wonderful. They came for years, and then afterwards we would have a little luncheon out in the patio, and that was very nice. Well, I think our Mother's Day teas every year were lovely events. Almost all of our ladies were mothers, and we also had the Easter hat parade every year, and sometimes in the early days the ladies were able to decorate their own hats.
The monthly birthday parties, the birthday parties for Pat, the beautiful Mother's Day tea, all the socials that they had, and the care with which they gave each individual person were the things that were the most outstanding at Rockhaven.
We'd have to start on the flower beds, like for the different Mother's Day teas, we'd have to start on that work alone, probably 2 months ahead.
We always had parties, and sometimes the nursing assistants would try to get the patients up and dance with them. They'd love to do that. Once a month we would have an international dinner. Like in October we would have an Oktoberfest, and we would have German singers and dancers, and we would serve sauerbraten. And I can remember going to Berlino's in Montrose and getting a Black Forest cake. That was always my favorite part of the meal. And we had Cinco de Mayo days, and in July we always had Bastille Day. You know, tried to do something to make people think of experiences that they may have had in their life.
The environment within Rockhaven so nearly resembled the outside world that sometimes even the staff had difficulty remembering this was a specialized nursing care facility, and the ladies they encountered were residents.
When I applied for a job there, she took me around and she took me in the dining room, and there was a religious service. And all the ladies were in there. I did not know they were the patients. They were all so beautifully dressed, and their hair was done, and I didn't know it was patients. I thought it was visitors. But that's the way it was maintained. Everything so nice for everybody.
Mrs. Richards and Pat Travis were the people that were responsible for the environment. And the workers, she took care of a lot of aides that had been patients that didn't have jobs, and she gave them jobs to help.
Miss Travis and Mrs. Richards were, I'm sure, much loved by the very people she was taking care of.
The nursing staff at Rockhaven was carefully selected, not only for their professional skills, but for their compassion and understanding of what Rockhaven represented.
I was day charge nurse, which involves giving medication, doing treatments, and supervising the nurses' aides. I was in charge of about 60 residents. I worked for 31 years.
I started at Rockhaven probably in 1958 or 1959. I was there 8 years. I trained at USC and trained 9 months for occupational therapy. And then I went to Camarillo State Hospital, which was horrible. But the shock, seeing how people were treated, was more than I'd ever anticipated. I saw how beautiful Rockhaven was. So then I applied there, and then Pat hired me.
Working at Rockhaven definitely made me a better person. I worked a lot of facilities, and it was so different from your regular convalescent home because of the pride everyone took in their work, and knowing that we had such a wonderful reputation. And working for someone like Pat Travis, you had better be at your best. And if you weren't, you learned how to be.
We found up on the walls, and they are still there, notes from the nursing staff that will say, please be sure to treat this individual particularly kindly. She's been very sore. Little notes like that are still on the walls from the staff that was here when the city acquired the property, that began to give you a feeling of there is something really remarkable about the site.
I always wanted to go to work. It was such a pleasure to go to work. It was refreshing, relaxing, and it's like you were in a different world.
Rockhaven's level of care was dramatically different than the neighboring sanitariums, due to Agnes Richards' philosophy of care. In 1982, a film entitled Frances depicted the tragic life of rising Hollywood star Frances Farmer at a nearby sanitarium. Despite the dramatic difference between these facilities, some mental health industry standard treatments were used in the early days of Rockhaven. Electroshock therapy was one such treatment, at the time thought to be innovative, and as mentioned in some of the earliest brochures about Rockhaven, which were found on the site when the city acquired the property.
Most of our electroshock therapy was done in the 40s and the 50s before I became administrator, but I assisted with some of them, so I think that as it phased out, I probably assisted with some. The laws then changed because there was a lot of opposition to electroshock therapy, and the requirements to give a person became much more strict than they were earlier.
Treatments were given in patients' rooms in the Oaks and the Annex buildings. Another area where Rockhaven's policies changed over time involved the conversion of the dorms building into a hospital.
Part of our admission policy, we did not take non-ambulatory patients, but when some of our own patients lost their ability to be ambulatory, we were so fond of them that we didn't want to have them move.
You know, in Rockhaven, you need to take advantage of the grounds and everything and remain active. So that was a problem when they become less ambulatory.
So we created a infirmary type building and care where they could have bedside nursing care, they could be hand-fed, they could be put up in a wheelchair every day and taken out in the gardens, just so that they could have the kind of care that they needed.
Agnes Richards wished to preserve the special environment that she had worked so hard to create since 1923. And what better administrator to follow in her footsteps than her own granddaughter, Patricia Travis. Pat's earliest memories of Rockhaven were those of a wonderful childhood, surrounded by friends.
As a child, my grandmother would bring me over. My first memory was that the patients were making my doll clothes. And I remember that we had just gotten in our intercom, and she called up there and said, "Put everything away. Patsy is coming up to visit," because I used to love to come and visit the patients. When I grew up, we would have summer vacations at Newport Beach, and our roommates very often would be patients from Rockhaven. My grandmother would come down on the weekends, and she would bring different patients down. We had a nurse or two staying in the house, but then she would have a change of the guard. You know, each week she would bring different people down for a little change. And on our school holidays, we would come and stay with her, and we would be entertaining patients very often. Rockhaven was my home.
As she grew older, she began to work into the role that would one day be hers.
Well, I started when I was in high school. My duties were to drive people and do banking for my grandmother, and then I would answer the telephone and maybe do letters, because I was always good at secretarial work.
At the age of 22, Pat undertook the biggest responsibility of all as administrator of Rockhaven, where she remained until 2001, devoting 48 years of her life towards making Rockhaven a home for hundreds of ladies.
I went to work full-time in 1954, although I had spent summer vacations, and other times at Rockhaven, sometimes working and sometimes as a volunteer. In 1956, my grandmother decided to go to Northern Europe and Russia and left me in charge. It was just so gradual because my grandmother did not pass away until 1967, and she was 86 years old when she died. She may have spent less time coming to Rockhaven, but I mean, she never retired. I always considered her the head honcho at Rockhaven, always. And she did consider herself that too. But as her health diminished, I would take on more and more responsibility.
Patricia Travis was responsible for everything there. She was involved 7 days a week, and when she left, it was like letting the air out of a balloon. No one could ever live up to what she did.
I think what I enjoyed the most was probably fixing up things so that they'd be tasteful and beautiful for the patients, and planning activities more so than the paperwork involved with being an administrator. I would have been a perfect activity director because I saw how much it meant to the patients to have things look nice. You know, a lot of times when your memory is confused, it's the immediacy, what you see right now, that will make you feel happy or sad. And it was the pleasure that it gave so many people to see nice things around them.
Well, Miss Travis was ahead of her time. Everything was for the benefit of the residents, to make them, to bring out their best ability, to keep them active. They were set up according to their mental and physical abilities.
I met her the first time at Rockhaven, and at that time we became friends, and she took me different places, and she had a lot of interests, and a really nice person, so it was fun. Pat's friendship was such that it enabled me to meet a lot of situations that I wouldn't have been able to meet otherwise, with her guidance and knowledge and her grandmother's guidance and knowledge.
She was friendly to every person. And when she'd have like parties down on this area, she would say, look, you don't have to come, but please come. And that coaxed them to come down here. Very few that didn't come down.
Pat went to work every day, 6 days a week, whether she was well or sick, and on Friday was her day off. So on Friday we would leave in the morning, and she would either shop for the patients or for herself. She worked all the other days from early morning till late at night, so it was an escape for her and really nice for me. And then she always made it possible for me to go to really nice places and take care of me.
Pat Travis was a lovely lady, and she was very grateful for everything that was done.
I've worked with very good directors of nurses and very good staff, but nothing like Rockhaven. And it was all due to Miss Travis. I mean, she was someone so special that you just don't come across that.
I don't think that there would ever be a place for anybody to be taken care of as well as Rockhaven, with Pat and her grandmother taking care of them there now or in the future ever.
From the 24 individuals that called Rockhaven home in 1924, the facility eventually housed 104 residents.
The type of patients that we took after my grandmother left, we went from taking care of people with mental problems into taking care of people with no memory. So it changed in the fact that more activities, because if you could keep the patients stimulated, they wouldn't go back in the past and be looking for their mother and father or wanting to go home as much. They would be stimulated by doing things, and their mind would be occupied, because you have to give care for what the patients need. Their needs changed, and we changed to meet those needs.
And if they could walk, they were brought outside whenever they could be. They had everything to enjoy in the way of beauty, and They were taken out to lunch. They did activities according to what they could do. There used to be volunteers that would come in and play bridge with the ones that could do that. So they were expected to live up to their potential, whatever it was.
As the 20th century moved into its second half, a number of sanitariums were still operating in the Crescenta Valley. The area had become popular with celebrities and movie stars who sought a quiet place to overcome addictions, or what was referred to as nervous breakdowns.
And they say that the one I admire isn't even remotely concerned.
Some of the names of ladies that lived here, made their home here, that you would probably recognize would be Billy Burke, who was Mrs. Flo Ziegfeld. Billy Burke was in the Pines Cottage, and Peggy Fears, who was a very well-known Ziegfeld Follies dancer and a singer in her own right, and a producer, a Hollywood producer. And Josephine Dillon, Clark Gable's first wife, and Lady Sylvia Ashley's sister. Lady Sylvia Ashley married Clark Gable and Douglas Fairbanks. And when I talked to her daughter, I said, wow, she married both Douglas. She said, yeah, Aunt Sil really hit the big time. And Gladys Ely, which is Marilyn Monroe's mother. Mrs. Ely was in the annex and was with us for over 10 years.
Gladys Ely made headlines for a daring escape from Rockhaven.
Well, she was just missing, and I think they found that she had tied sheets. It sounds almost like a movie where people would try to escape with sheets. Apparently it worked because she ended up in Lakeview Terrace at some church, and she wasn't gone too long. They, naturally called us right away.
Go into one of the bedrooms, and there's a small closet, and there's a fur coat inside, Bullocks of Pasadena. It's a beautiful piece of clothing. That one's particularly striking. And around in this room there are photos. There are photos from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And they're of a resident who lived here in the late 80s and 90s, Marion Statler Rose. The photos that were there were of her and her husband, Don Rose, a Canadian dancer, and in fact, as we found out, she was a dancer starting in the late teens and through the 40s. She grew up in the Glendale area. They spent the last 50 years of their lives in the Verdugo woodlands, and they toured all over the world as Statler and Rose, and they performed with Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, and they were in an original movie, The King of Jazz, and did remarkable dance. The people that know them describe them as simply the most loving, wonderful couple. What remained of her life was stored away in the second story bedroom of one of the buildings on the site. And because of what was left, we've been able to learn more about the people that were here and the significance of what they contributed.
Exploring the Rockhaven grounds today, one can easily imagine how they appeared during their golden years. The grounds were, in fact, a large part of the therapy for the residents. The beauty of the grounds was attributed to longtime groundskeeper Ivan Cole.
I was the latter of the groundsmen to have been on this location. I came and joined Rockhaven in 1963. And I retired in 1997. That was 34 years of constant maintenance of this property. I worked here because I felt this was the right place I should be.
Immigrating here from Great Britain, Ivan had obtained a degree in horticulture at Pierce College and worked for the famous Burkhardt's Nursery in Pasadena.
In the beginning, there was a lot of work here, but at that time, everything here was jungle land. Everything was growing on top of everything. Dead shrubs, live shrubs. I could see what the place was and its sheer beauty of the big trees and everything like that. But landscaping was practically nil. So Mrs. Richards couldn't find someone who wanted to do this kind of work. Because this is quite an immense facility in its nature is all work. And if you don't maintain and keep up with it, you're going to lose it. It's like a dwarf looking at a giant when you sense the magnitude. And it's not that big a piece of property, but it looks big.
Ivan's efforts paid off, and the Rockhaven grounds bloomed under his care.
Most all of this plant life, as you see today, the big shrubs, are still the big shrubs they had. We were able in time to save them.
It was so refreshing. The grounds were so beautiful. I mean, you just couldn't be in a bad mood there because it was just gorgeous. The flowers, the trees, and the old buildings. I mean, everything was just wonderful. I used to wish that I could get married again so I could have a wedding there.
Every inch of this place was my favorite. There was a tree right around the end of the pavement in front of the office, and that was a tropical rain tree. And that was the most magnificent tree, and it was a flower, a beautiful yellow flower. It was like a piece of jewelry.
The grounds at Rockhaven were exceptionally beautiful, lots of care.
These huge oaks, 26 oaks, they're treasures, and they've lasted all these years. You know, it's a magnificent background. It's ideal for the setting.
I think that the most important architectural feature of this place is the gardens themselves. And I love what the city's doing with them. They're doing a nice maintenance level on them. The next step would be restoration, and I'm going to love to see that happen.
When you start wandering around the gardens of Rockhaven, one of the things that you can't help being struck by are the statues. All throughout the gardens, there's a number of statues, fountains, bird baths, unique garden furniture and furnishings that just adds a whole different kind of a quality to the site. When you look at the black and white photos from the 30s and 40s and 50s, you can see that they were trying to create a Mediterranean kind of a feel. The statues are really remarkable. They're such an unusual and beautiful feature to have on the site, and many of them were nestled back in plants, so you just caught little glimpses of the statue back through the foliage. And there's smaller little animals, squirrels and little bunnies, undoubtedly for the purpose of just creating this more to feel like a beautiful place, a beautiful home to be living in. As the different buildings were built, the walkways were developed to connect the buildings together, and then the sidewalk might take off to a little seating area, just a little place for the residents where they could go and just sit down and enjoy the absolutely beautiful air and enjoy the garden.
Most of the architecture is representative of the 10s, 20s, 30s. And that's the growth period of this valley. So our original historic structures that we have around us here in the valley are of this style. Here's this beautiful archway up here, the mission style, colonial style. It's highly representative of that period of time. It's a perfect example. As soon as you see an arched entryway like that, it just screams the 20s, California.
The Rock House originally housed patients, but later became an administration building. Badly damaged in the 1971 earthquake, it was declared uninhabitable and demolished by the city of Glendale.
And the earthquake did hit. I was home at the time. But my greatest fear was what was happening at Rockhaven. Well, I tried calling, but there were so many lines down, there was no connection. So as quick as I could, I got myself put together, and I came in. And I was quite shocked at the way the Rockhaven building was, the older building.
That was an experience that was kind of nice for an administrator because all of our off-duty personnel came in. They said, you know, things fell down in my kitchen and in my home. I closed the doors and came to work because I knew you needed me more.
After a few days, I'll have to call the city of Glendale to see if someone would come out and inspect the rock house, the building, because I wouldn't want to see it occupied in its present condition.
Well, we've been in that building for 50 years, and I think there was Mr. Solomon, Public Works, and he said, you have 3 days, and I didn't know what to do with everything. I had to go out and rent a trailer. We were in a trailer for a year.
A replacement structure was built to house offices and a meeting room. The administration building still stands on the site today.
This could have been built in a very simple utilitarian way, but Agnes Richards, the founder, that's not what she wanted to do. You look at things like wrought iron railing that's clearly custom made, remarkable details on the railings.
All of this ironwork was done by the Huntington Iron Works in La Cañada. Mr. Huntington crafted these iron elements in an artistic manner.
Every building is unique. Each one is its own individual architectural masterpiece.
Pat Travis retired from Rockhaven in 2001 after selling the facility to the Ararat organization. Ararat maintained it as a nursing home for several more years before announcing plans to sell in late 2006.
One of the council members has been aware of the Rockhaven project for a number of years, and he's really the one who initially brought the concept of acquiring Rockhaven to the city council for consideration. And this was because the original owners of Rockhaven had sold the facility to another healthcare provider who they actually had plans for perhaps demolishing these buildings and building a new facility on the site. And the city council clearly saw that there was a lot of potential for a different level of interpretation and use, and just the significance of preserving this very important history.
Rockhaven would be a perfect place for a library and a cultural center, kind of like Brand Library or McGroarty Arts Center over in Tujunga.
I couldn't stand the sign that said to be let go to a contractor. Well, what would a contractor do with a place like this? He'd tear it down. He wanted the land. He didn't want any of all this other. He'd rip it all down and build nice homes or something in there for the wealthy. And I thought, yeah, I'm not going to let him. I'm going to fight you tooth and nail.
The residents here had fought the initial expansion when Ararat Homes had it. They initially wanted to level the entire place and build a modern structure here, multi-story modern structure, and people just came unglued. The amount of oak trees, the historic value here was just going to be hosed.
In the spring of 2007, the Glendale City Council decided to explore the possibility of the city of Glendale purchasing this historic site.
Probably started in 2007 when the city of Glendale became aware that this property was going to be on the market and developed an interest in acquiring it.
Well, we helped make this become a reality by being advocates for it. We went out and educated people about it. You know, we collected photographs of it and displayed them. We went to city council meetings and talked about what a great contribution Agnes Richards had made to the role of mental health for women in the United States. She was a pioneer in that field.
I owe a great debt of gratitude to Mike and Pam Lawler. They are the people who really steered me to come here. They wanted to take pictures of Rockhaven was like then, and they arranged the meetings at City Hall. We had, you know, a few meetings down there before. They said that they were going to promote this.
The proposed plan included purchasing Rockhaven, to build a new Montrose library on the vacant part of the site, which would allow the existing Montrose Fire Station to expand into the old library space. The last facet of the plan included using a city-owned parking lot to create a new retail anchor for Montrose Shopping Park, with the idea that it would generate the money to renovate Rockhaven through the sales tax.
And every meeting we went to, I said, you know, I'm here because I don't want this property to fall into the hands of a building contractor. I want this to remain Rockhaven forever.
The City Council began deliberating on whether or not to acquire Rockhaven and really was working in the negotiation process through late 2007, beginning of 2008 when the final decisions were actually made.
Every city department would have a role to play in this historic site.
A number of different departments, the library, the Parks and Recreation Department, the Planning Department, they all played very key roles initially in developing information and providing documentation about the site, cost estimates for rehabilitation of the site, and just options about how the City Council might consider going about the decision-making process.
The community was excited about the proposition, and the pieces began to fall together. At $55 per square foot, the over 3-acre property was a bargain.
The city primarily used capital improvement funds to acquire the site, and in April of 2008 closed escrow in the amount of just a little bit under $8.3 million for the acquisition of Rockhaven. And I had a role of just learning a little bit about Rockhaven and why it was important, but initially helping with the acquisition of the property and to determine what the next steps were. The Rockhaven property is about 3¼ acres. And there's 15 buildings that are currently located on the Rockhaven property, and they're pretty much all nestled onto the east half of the site. So there's quite a large open space area that's associated with Rockhaven, and then this colony of buildings.
When city representatives first toured the Rockhaven site after the acquisition, their excitement grew. Although the landscaping had become overgrown and some of the bushes and trees could not be saved, it was easy to see the great potential in the site. The site was overgrown, walkways covered in debris, the trees in need of care. But there was something very special about the property, and this was not lost on those who visited the site.
Boy, the grounds were unkempt, but I think the bigger concern was the facilities themselves, the buildings. The buildings had been open in some areas, exposed to the elements, and the elements damaging the buildings. So, we started cleaning things up, boarding some of the buildings out to protect it from the elements. So we want to protect as much of the facility as we can right now, and then go in and do the repairs and renovations at a later date.
Today, the buildings are silent, but they still house the memories of what was once a bustling long-term care facility. Beds remain in many of the rooms, as if awaiting the next resident. A storage area contains the clothes, pictures, and other personal belongings of the women who spent their last days at Rockhaven. The ovens in the kitchen are cold now, but glassware and dishes still stand on the shelves. Remains of the past are visible everywhere.
We were very fortunate on the very first days. Things were simply untouched inside the building. So Mother's Day cards were still set up. Little dried flowers were still in flower vases.
It's as though aliens came down and abducted the residents, because it almost looks like that. It almost looks like they were just lifted out of their rooms, everything left behind. Their stuff is still in the closet. It's all there. It's like a preserved little time capsule of their lives here.
The artifacts that have been left in the buildings it's almost tragic that they're still here, that they aren't with a family someplace. But in many cases, the residents who were here, when they passed on, there simply wasn't anybody to take what was left of their lives, their photos, their clothes, their pieces of furniture. Those things have been all moved into safe keeping now. They've been documented, and we'll use all of those in the future.
It's important to know the history of anyone's history or the history of a place that you live in. I think it just gives you a connection to the past that is really needed for future generations. So to us it's important. We've done more restorations, not just this one. You know, we've done a historic gas station restoration, a bungalow. So we really respect history and what that brings with it.
Things have changed so much now that it could no longer compete as a facility for taking care of nursing care patients. But I think it would be just wonderful as a community center.
The scope of Rockhaven's restoration is substantial. Not only do trees and landscaping need to be brought back to life or replaced, but each of the remaining structures will be assessed. The general consensus of the community, however, is that this facility is a significant part of Glendale's past, and preserving it for the future is a responsibility not to be taken lightly.
The future for Rockhaven is what's being planned right now. I think the one thing that we can say with some assurance is that Rockhaven is going to be preserved, and the significance of the activities and the buildings will be preserved and interpreted.
I think we are going to be able to restore the gardens, and that's going to be the first work we do, is restore some of the gardens, allow people to come and enjoy the gardens, and then we'll proceed to the buildings on site. But we want to make it look like it did back when this place first opened.
And there was a lot of consideration about the potential reuse for Rockhaven, whether it would be appropriate to relocate the Montrose Library onto this site, to just leave the site as it is and use the buildings to interpret what life at Rockhaven had been, to bring in some kind of art opportunities, local artist opportunities, or historic opportunities, relocation of perhaps a historical society. A lot of different options were considered, including, of course, just the conversion of the grounds or allowing the grounds to be used as a passive park area.
And I would like the people of this valley to become invested in this place, to kind of feel like they own it in a sense, along with the city.
Well, this is going to be a park, so we are the key agency in this. So our role is really going to be once we get the assessment we have a company or consultants doing a historic assessment on the site. Once we get that, we're going to take it out to the community, do a master plan for the site, really involve the community in terms of what they want to see happen to this site, and then proceed with that master plan and the timeline to renovate the buildings. It won't be overnight. I think it may be one building a year for a little while until the economy picks up and we see more dollars in our capital projects fund.
I think if they can maintain the atmosphere and maintain what we have here, I think they couldn't lose.
I can see the potential for a wonderful plans that the city has expressed that they want to make here, and I'm very excited about that because I think it's such a wonderful compliment to my grandmother and to Rockhaven that this will be a community center that everyone can enjoy.
I can't wait till we open it. I think the community is really going to enjoy this site, and it's going to be a fabulous park, like a number of other parks that we have with historic components in it. They're going to love it, and I can't wait to open it up.
The grounds would make a beautiful site for receptions and gatherings, much like Casa Verdugo or Brand Library. Restoring the gardens to become public space to give back to the residents of Glendale to enjoy. Preserving a time capsule of what our past was, and in doing that, a glimmer of what Glendale's future is, preserving our history and traditions.
It's not over now that the city has it. It's just transitioning into a whole nother use. Rockhaven will go on and on.